Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists did. They absolutely got it correct. And this is Tom Navolis, your host, and I am delighted to have you with me as I adjust all of my settings and everything that we have going on around here today, as much as all that's going on in this nation, in your state. That is where I would like to go again today, is not only talking about those declared charges. We'll just briefly cover a couple more, because I think where we are when we look at all that is going on from the legal slash political environment, that what comes to mind for me is we have lost our way over 100 years ago, almost 200 years ago, when it comes to what does it mean to develop our legal system? What does it mean to raise up lawyers? And for that discussion, what I want to do is take us back to even the title of the program and the second portion of it that says Tucker tucked away. Now, many of you would think that just with that title alone, that you would think I'm talking about Tucker Carlson. Well, I'm not. I'm not talking about Tucker Carlson at all. Who I'm talking about in this program is none other than St. George Tucker, who not only was at the early convention in Maryland, or should I say that gathering in Maryland prior to the Constitutional Convention, but that he became one of the most influential people in analyzing and writing a commentary on the Constitution. So it's important for us to understand that what we saw at the beginning of the nation, as we have even today, is this disparate perspective of foundational thought, of thought between what was happening in the New England area and then what was happening south, Virginia, and down. It's extremely critical that how do I even say it? It's just extremely critical to understand that that difference has not changed. What we see happening in the Ivy League schools right now, and then as it has spread through academia in general, is this difference. Joseph Story was the key difference in everything that was there in the greater New England area. He was the one that his ideas, his commentaries on the Constitution, to which I have quoted from in the past. I've talked a lot about them in the past. But I had to go back and take the time to really look at, and I have not exhausted that study again, of St. George Tucker, and how he wrote and he discussed the Constitution and constitutionalism from Blackstone's perspective. We're going to deal with a lot of the history here in that commentary as we get to it. Obviously, we're not going to get to the details of it, and I'm not even going to be able to give you all of the distinguishing differences between what Joseph Story took as a perspective on various areas in relationship then to which St. George Tucker took in relationship to those constitutional debates and concepts. But I have to say that the differences are no difference than that which are the arguments between the leftist and what we would call constitutionalists today. And to the extent that what we're going to have to understand when we look at it is how are these charges within the Declaration of Independence viewed as we would go to war, as we would take and look at our modern charges in relationship to those even now. And then what does that mean from an application perspective in constitutional interpretation? Sadly, after the Civil War, a lot of St. George Tucker was tucked away. It was tucked away because, once again, you had the New England North becoming self-righteous instead of looking at their Puritan heritage in a broader perspective. They became the imposing factor in how we would even look at the functionality of the Constitution. To which we have to argue as well is that the New Englanders, under the likes of John Adams in particular, and then that New Yorker Hamilton, began to pressure from the Federalist perspective the destruction of this nation in its early inception. So you figure that here we went through 8 years of George Washington trying to establish a nation that would function under the vitality of the Declaration of Independence, of taking and trying to bring together this new dynamic form of representative government. And within the scope of an 8-year period of time, when Adams now becomes president, and again, John Adams, because you have to remember that Sam Adams stood fast on his, anti-federalist political party view. He was a true federalist, no different than St. George Tucker would be. And Adams, Sam, did not live past 1803. So then what we see is that John Adams' presidency takes a whole different turn, as we'll discuss here in a little while. But first off, what I want to take us into is a quick dive into the Declaration of Independence and two charges that I think are critical for us to at least do a review of and try and bring them together, as then we're going to look at the beginning of what St. George Tucker had to say in relationship of constitutionalism and all the way back to Blackstone. Now, for those that do not recall or have never heard of Blackstone, he was the predominant writer and person that wrote the commentaries on the English Constitution. If you would remember from other programs that I spoke to over the course of these many years that I've been doing these programs, is that our founders, the people that even lived during the period of the colonies, actually had copies of Blackstone in their homes. They would have copies of the Bible, and they would have copies of Blackstone. And that's where General Gage, reporting back into Parliament and into the King's Court, would say that we were tinkerers, if you will, of law. That, for the most part, the citizenry in the colonies had a greater understanding as to how the English Constitution would function and what liberties were and what common law was greater than those that came to rule over them, greater than those that were in the courts of America. Of course, that being the English representatives that came to America, not those that were elected or put into place from the American colonies. So as we look at these charges in the next couple minutes, we need to look at them that the people understood liberty and how law should function because they understood Blackstone. And when they studied to become a lawyer, they would study Blackstone. So let's look at the second charge. The second charge in the Declaration of Independence is, he forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. So when we go to the analysis in the document that I shared with you last week and again this week on the Declaration of Independence and these notes, the note here for the second charge says, in several instances, the king instructed royal governors to block pending colonial legislation. At times, months or years then would pass before the king addressed a colonial enactment, if ever. What's interesting here is that what we're seeing is not just from a federal perspective in taking and blocking state actions, so therefore destroying the ideas of what is federalism in a republican structure. What does it mean from a states' rights perspective then in relationship to the subsuming activities, as I always said, that Hamilton wanted to have, and even Madison to a great extent, over all of the states, destroying states' rights. What we see also is that these laws that states are putting into place would be that of local government in relationship to what it means within the context of this state constitution. The problem that we have now from a federal perspective is that St. George Tucker predicted in so many ways that what we would see is both by law, Congress, and then the courts would likely obviate the states. We're going to get into this a little bit more as we get into the next several ideas in the other segments. So the other charge that I wanted to bring out as well is the second charge, or the third charge actually, where the king has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. We're going to pick this up definitely more in the next segment and in the third segment, but in the next segment for sure. But you have to remember that in the analysis it says that the British officials feared large legislative bodies as parochial and democratic. So they sought to restrict their growth. This restriction left many new frontier communities poorly represented in their colonial assemblies. See, this is what is happening now today, especially when we're seeing corrupt elections. So come on back in the next segment as we continue these discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they did. They got it absolutely correct. And as we're looking at the charges of the Declaration of Independence, we need to look at those that actually participated in all of the various events of the time and the distinguishing differences in the early interpretive perspective of the Constitution. I look at, once again, mostly in the northern states, if you will, those were adhered to from a constitutional commentary point of view of John Jay. And then as we look at Joseph Story. Now, Joseph Story, as I said before, he had a lot of great things to say, but Joseph Story being a Federalist, there were areas that obviously his view and his perspective were going to be tied to that idea of who the Federalists were, what they were all about, and then some of those differences. I wanted to continue on right now with that idea that I spoke of, or what I should say is the second charge that I brought to you today, that being of the refusal to pass other laws for the accommodation of the large districts. And I went quickly through that charge from its analytical perspective in the document that I sent you on the Declaration of Independence and the notes, or I should say it's in there at samueladamsreturns.net for today's program, is that the British officials feared large legislative bodies as parochial and democratic, so they sought to restrict their growth. This restriction left many new frontier communities poorly represented in their colonial assemblies. I'm going to take this a little bit further and actually digress into our modern times, into the late 1800s, early 1900s, when Congress made the decision to cap how many elected persons would be in Congress. Now, as you remember, maybe you don't, but as you should remember, is that originally the Constitution set that there should be representation for one congressman to 30,000 people. We don't have that anymore. So if we had that, Congress was saying that the representation would be out of control, that you would never get anything done in the federal Congress. Well, they don't really anyway, and they should only stay focused on those things that are pertinent to the Constitution and what was strictly defined in the Constitution. As we're going to see that difference between John Jay as well as Joseph Story, as well as Hamilton, as then what? Tucker, St. George Tucker, and the ideas there. But we have what's going on in these first two charges, and I kind of want to finish up with those real quickly so that we can get into the historical perspective of this. And the instances that we have with charge number 2 on the passage of laws alone, that what we're seeing in particular are the way that the bureaucracies are now acting. And not only that, what we're going to look at is St. George Tucker's greatest fear was that the presidency would act outside of the framework of the Constitution. And that was both in the treaty aspects in particular. That was his first concern, and we'll cover that in more detail in a bit. But in addition to the potentials of the growth of the bureaucratic state. And that is where the presidency now takes and obviates the other two branches of government. And that's a critical area to understand, is that when you have the presidency taking and obviating them by its direct mechanisms of operation, you now are taking and setting up limitations on the states and local governments able to govern within the context of their state constitutions. And now what you're doing is everything that I've talked about and the fears of the anti-federalist in general about the federal government obviating everything in relationship to the states. We've seen it over and over. As well then, as we haven't even begun to get into the courts taking and having their play in relationship to how they, and this was one of Tucker's concerns, they would take and override and obviate that which Congress does in law and try to create law. So what we have here and what's going on in relationship to those two charges is that we're seeing that once again there is a great violation of our rights at this level and what's happening in the federal level with the presidency as well as courts and Congress. So the he or the king is even larger when it comes to what is the federal government. And this charge applies to them. The next charge in refusing that accommodation of those larger districts, as I was already bringing to you, that face it, the bureaucracy, as well as the rest of the swamp monsters, if you want to call that, at every level in the administration as well as in Congress, they don't want us to be duly represented. As I open this segment, we basically now have one representative for over 1 million people. Are we duly represented in the federal government? And the fact that the senators are no longer appointed by the state legislatures at the Senate level, the states are no longer represented according to the intent of the Constitution. Therefore, we the people do not have proper representation, and it is because they are afraid, they fear the democratic aspect of what we are in our republic and the functioning of it. Now, what we're going to get into as we finish out this segment, and definitely in the third segment, is what St. George Tucker was looking at from the perspective of the development of the Constitution and the way that it was put into play. It was not by the Constitutional Convention. What St. George Tucker argues and clearly defines in his work is that this Constitution is ratified by the people at the state constitutional conventions. In fact, in this work that I am giving you a link to is the clear view of the Constitution of the United States with selected writings by St. George Tucker in relationship to not only Blackstone, but his other writings, is that what Tucker stresses that the American Constitution are written declarations ratified by the people of the states, and they are to be interpreted through their plain text and through the instruments of the people's consent, and not by speculative writers on government or by office holders, the people's delegates. So what we're looking at and what Tucker was talking about is that the Federalist Papers, we have a lot of people, we even have the Federalist Society, we have a number of them that take and look at the Federalist Papers as that greater overshadowing or that definition as to how the Constitution should take and function. But no, that's not how it's supposed to work. What Tucker says is that we need to look at the state conventions. We need to look at those state constitutional conventions and even refer back even to the Anti-Federalist Papers. But most importantly, above all of that, is the state ratifying conventions. Because you have to remember, we had two states that one refused totally to take and ratify the Constitution. And then New York, because it walked out of the federal Constitution at the end there, it ratified it after it was actually accepted. So there's a lot that we don't understand because we're not taught. And the fact of what I think is really critical in understanding what it means to develop not only our legal system, which is not being done anymore. Tucker has a comment that he makes is that, if you're going to become a lawyer, some of what you need to really pay attention to is not only national history, but your state's history and state constitution. Otherwise, how are you going to be able to understand the maintenance of liberty? As we have to consider that we have lost what is necessary in understanding state and federal constitution. What is taught in law schools is nothing but what is in the revised codes. How do you play out? How do you argue within the context of those revised code? And how do you look at precedent instead of understanding the true foundational perspectives of a constitution? And this federal constitution being limited in the number of times that it has been amended, we can truly say that we can look at Tucker's idea that we have to look at the text, and any interpretation would be that as it is related to the contextual perspective of the people at the time that the Constitution was adopted. There you can get the meaning, not from the Federalist Papers, not even from the Anti-Federalist Papers, but the state constitutional conventions. When it comes to the state conventions and the state constitutions, as we talked about in Ohio, those have been so bastardized in its intent and politicized so that the people have truly lost the moral context of what the original state constitutions were all about. So we're at that point now where we have to get back to understanding even those that are in the practice of law. Remember, practice means you practice, and you'll never be perfect. Well, we'll come back to more of this as we get into the third segment. Sam Adams And the Anti-Federalists clearly understood the potential hazards of the Constitution, and so should you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists did get it correct, and this is Tom Navolis, your host. And as we move into this last segment, I want to begin with a quote from St. George Tucker, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about him. But everything that we see going on in our economy, everything that we look at now, everybody is confused in my mind because we don't know our history, is that we have economy so tied to whatever is going on in the government. But Tucker makes this very, very interesting statement, and I'm going to say it slowly so that you can take and grasp it, mull it over, and try to internalize it for yourself, because it is life-changing, as much as how much I would love to talk to you about a paper that I read on the premillennialism, and that the early church did not accept it. But we have so many people out there that believe in it in our modern times, which is no different than what Tucker was talking about here in relationship to how people glom on to things that are not necessarily factually true, and we see the result of it in policy and everything else that goes on in relationship to how we are governed and our liberty. So this is a quote from page 28 of the book that is there listed in your references. And it says this: a prosperous government and people, a prosperous government and a prosperous people are not the same thing. So let me do that again for you one more time. A prosperous government and a prosperous people are not the same thing. So in other words, the government should not be tied to our economy as it is. That alone, ladies and gentlemen, goes back into the charges in the Declaration of Independence on how the government of Great Britain was constricting individuals' abilities to act within commerce. That is a violation of liberty and is the purest concept of tyranny and despotism on what we have, especially with the fact that we've talked about many times before in relationship to the likes of the Federal Reserve and the income tax system that we all live under. Direct taxation. We know that in fact is, and a graduated income tax in particular, is all part of what we now know to be communism. And just as a reminder, here's the question: when was the Communist Manifesto published? I'm going to leave it with you. And you have to figure that out, because then look at what was happening at that time in our history. Okay, so let's do a little homework on who this guy, St. George Tucker, was. St. George Tucker was someone who took and actually fought and served in the American Revolution. In fact, when we look at his collegiate time, is that he was there during the time that Patrick Henry made his great statements as well on give me liberty or give me death. So Tucker was at the beginning of this nation. And what was so differentiating in his work is that, once again, he republicanized Blackstone. He took what Blackstone, whose writings were that around what was going on in England, Great Britain, that parliamentary form of government, and what was happening in relationship to the form of the king being there. And Blackstone's work was indispensable, as I talked about before. But it was problematic for America because the principles of monarchy and aristocracy were repudiated by the American Revolution. So when we took and we said, okay, what form of government were we going to have? And the fact that it was going to be now a democratic republic, a constitutionally devised democratic republic, the democracy being in how we elect the House, and then the republic on how the senators were to be put into place, with an independent judiciary, as well as then an administrative branch to carry out that which the people, through their delegates, would view with limited powers of the federal government. That's what we don't have anymore. What we don't have is a federal government functioning with limited power, and the fact that we, the people, are the sovereigns of this nation. So one of the things, the ideas that Tucker was trying to bring into Blackstone, because the fundamentals of Blackstone were strong and they had meaning within our Constitution and its development, but it needed to have that understanding of republicanism within it, and the stronger perspective that it is we, the people, that have that contract/covenant with the federal government, and they are subject to we, the people. So what we have here from a historical reading of this is the Americanized Blackstone was published. Tucker's revised Americanized Blackstone was published in Philadelphia in 1803 and was widely used thereafter up until the Civil War. And because it was from the south of the Mason-Dixon, the credibility went down, and it was from that historical perspective that what we have are the Northerners, the Ivy Leaguers, started putting down that view of constitutionalism. It was the great battle, you have to understand. It was that battle between the Hamiltonians, then the John Adams, the Federalist, against those that would be the more of the Jeffersonian Republicans, Democratic Republic, as they were called at that time. So he took and he wrote this, and to the fact that Tucker in 1813 was appointed by James Madison to the United States District Judge for all of Virginia. Very important. And he stayed there, and he resigned his career shortly before his death in 1827. So Tucker, as a jurist, never wavered once from the principles he had, especially when he was a he was the head. He took over for John Wyth at William and Mary as the professor of law there, and he definitely developed and established a dynasty of legal and constitutional talent that carried on the Jeffersonian principles through successive generations. And you can go to the book and you can read that history of his family and what occurred with that family and how they went on either in law or as members of as elected officials. But once again, I have to iterate, we see that Civil War period, and remember, I'll give you that hint, is that the Communist Manifesto came out before the Civil War happened. So the Civil War and the political power since the Civil War resulted in adjustments and accepted understanding of the Constitution, which are now today even. Tucker's principles of states' rights, limited government, are extremely strange to America in our present time. And unless we get back and remember these principles and that they were prevailing ideas during Tucker's time and for several generations. So you figure from that time of the Constitution, those late 1700s until just after the Civil War, we were functioning more and more attorneys, except those from a number of the northern states, were following the teachings and understanding of constitutionalism and the definition of constitutionalism as St. George Tucker defined it. Yeah, we had, I know, Joseph Story from the north, John Jay, one of the writers of the Federalist Papers. But the fact of the matter is, we had strong, true Republican concepts on constitutionalism. So, what we have to remember today as we look at those declared charges from the Declaration of Independence, and as we look at how the Constitution should be interpreted, both federal and states, everything is ratified by the people. Every amendment in the federal Constitution had to go to the states and have a ratifying convention made up of delegates of the people. Even the perverted Ohio Issue 1 that passed, that constitutional amendment, was ratified by the people. We have to understand this, and we have to be explicit that the ratifiers included reservations as to what was in the federal Constitution. That's why it's important. If you really want to understand the federal Constitution, you need to go back and read through, as I have done in the past, as you have to go through the states ratifying conventions in every term there. So what does it mean for today? Well, we have to look at what it means in arguing limited government and that the presidency is not the king, and that Congress cannot give its powers over to administrative offices. They can't do that. We have to hold our elected accountable, and we have to do that through individual involvement at every level of government, down from the school board or any other elected position, all the way up through and including the federal level. Ladies and gentlemen, it is absolutely important that we take the time to look at. And I beg you, read St. George Tucker for your liberty. Come back next week.